Okay, everybody, so I feel I confused people with this slide, so I wanted to make sure I reviewed it. But before we go into this slide, I wanted to do a simpler example. So let me go with an example I touched on in class, and let me draw it out for you. And it's a 2 by 2. Don't be too worried about what that means yet, but it just essentially means that you have two independent variables. So here's one IV, here's one IV with two levels. So the first independent variable is going to be regular cup of coffee. So I'm looking at caffeine, regular coffee, and then decaf. Actually, let me make that bigger. Too big. And decaf. And then I'm going to look at time of day for my other IV, morning, afternoon. Now keep in mind, I've decided on these two levels on my own, right? These two and these two, for some reason, right? So as the designer of the study, I made this choice. Time of day doesn't always have to be set up this way. It depends on how you set it up for your own specific study. Okay, so let's say I had a study that described a researcher who was interested in seeing how giving participants caffeine improved attention during a learning activity, right? But then I also was interested in seeing, well, how might time of day influence this outcome? So my DV is attention, but you don't need to know what the DV is to know what the IVs are or what the levels are. Okay, so here you have the design. You have one IV, caffeine, second IV, time of day, but let's break it down in a different way. So if I ask you for the levels, I'm pretty much asking you, well, what are the different experiences of each IV? So let's take this first IV here. So we'll take that one first. So I'm going to call it caffeine. Whoops. And then first I have a regular cup of coffee. And then, let's write it out. And then I have a decaf cup. That's all I have for caffeine. I designed it that way. The researcher designed it that way. You don't have to think of different situations. Just read the question and see what's being presented to you as a different experiences of caffeine. Again, it's only regular coffee or decaf in this example. Now, here you have, well, here you have more time of day. And keep in mind, these labels for the independent variable, they don't really matter, right? I could call it time. I could call this time. I could call this just coffee. You don't need to know the exact name of the independent variable to know how many levels. Here I was able to know there was 2 for this variable, even if I called it coffee. I could count that there's 2 different situations related to caffeine or coffee, depending on what you call it. Okay, now time of day. Think about how many experiences regarding time of day were built into this study. Well, in this example, I have morning and I have afternoon. Okay, so when I ask you for levels, I'm asking you just looking at the IVs, right? Just looking at the IVs, how many experiences are within that IV? Here for caffeine, you have 2 experiences that were designed. Here, you also have 2. So you have 2 levels for caffeine, 2 levels for time of day. Now, let's say I had a third level, green tea. Maybe I wanted people to try green tea too. Well, that would be a third level for caffeine, right? So let me erase that for now. I'll add it back in a second because I do want to show you an example, but now let's go into conditions. So those are levels. Now for conditions, let's look at this diagram on this side, and now we're thinking about the potential experiences a participant can have in this specific study. Okay, we have the levels, right? We just went through that. But okay, if the participants are experiencing both IVs in the study, what potential combinations of the levels could they experience? So they could have regular coffee in the morning, they could have decaf coffee in the morning, they could have regular coffee in the morning, or they could have decaf actually in the afternoon. So they could have regular coffee in the afternoon, they could have decaf coffee in the afternoon, right? There are 4 potential conditions, experiences that the participant can have in this study, shown here, and there are 2 levels shown here for the caffeine variable and 2 for the time of day. So let me actually add back in the green tea level, and actually that's not the eraser, here's the eraser. Now I added a level, not a variable, just a level to my existing independent variable of green tea. And let me add that to my diagram, my table on the left. So now you have regular coffee, decaf coffee, and now we have green tea. So we still have time of day, morning, afternoon. Now we have caffeine intake, regular coffee, decaf coffee, green tea. So caffeine has 3 levels now. Now in terms of conditions, how many levels do we have, right? So now you have to see how this actually changed these conditions. Now you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 conditions. So you have an example with where caffeine has 3 levels, time of day has 2 levels. These are conditions. These are the independent variables. And this is my DV, attention. Keep in mind, I haven't talked about the DV since I started this. I haven't described what the DV is. You can figure out the levels, you can figure out the IVs, and you can figure out the conditions without knowing what a DV is. What you have to make sure of is not to get confused and think that attention, my DV, is an independent variable or a level. That's where sometimes people get confused. So I'll stop here for this example. Then in the next video, get to explaining the delay of gratification study.